The tap. The mortuary had always felt like a second home to me. Some people dread the quietness of a place like that, but I found it comforting. It was the kind of job where routine ruled everything, where the stillness made sense. Death didn't scare me, it was predictable. That was until last December, when something shattered the illusion that IT started on a Thursday evening, during one of the busiest weeks of the year. The holidays tend to bring an uptick in cases, accidents, illnesses, even a few suicides. I was working alone that night, staying late to catch up. I had just finished preparing one of the bodies when I noticed an odd detail. The temperature in the room kept dropping. At first, I thought it was just the chilly winter air seeping in, so I adjusted the thermostat. But no matter how much I fiddled with it, the room only grew colder. I tried to ignore it and moved on to the next body, a middle-aged man who had died of a heart attack. Everything seemed normal at first. But as I reached for the tools, I noticed something on his face that made me pause. His expression seemed different. Not the typical, peaceful look most bodies had when they arrived. His features were twisted, almost as if he had died mid-scream. His mouth hung open, and his eyes, half shut, seemed frozen in some kind of horrified realization. I shrugged it off, telling myself that everyone reacts to death in their own way. As I began the process, I heard a faint tapping sound. It seemed to be coming from one of the cabinets on the far side of the room. I stopped, listening closely. Tap. 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 It was rhythmic, but quiet, like the sound of fingernails tapping on wood. Great. Probably a rat, I muttered to myself, and went to check. I flung the cabinet door open, half expecting to find a mouse or something. But there was nothing, just an old box of supplies and a few dusty jars. I closed the door and turned back to my work. That's when I heard it again. Tap. Tap. This time, it came from the other side of the room, near the door to the viewing area. I walked over, a bit more cautiously, feeling a growing unease. There was nobody there. The only thing in sight was the old wall clock, ticking away. But the tapping hadn't been coming from the clock. It was too soft, too deliberate. I returned to the embalming table, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. As I resumed my work, I glanced at the man's face again, and I swear it seemed like his expression had changed. His mouth was closed now, and his eyes were wide open, staring right at me. My pulse quickened. I knew I hadn't touched his face since I started. I took a step back, the hairs on my arms prickling. The room felt colder than ever, the air thick with a damp, musty smell. I was reaching for my phone to call a colleague, just to make sure I wasn't going completely nuts, when the lights flickered. They didn't go out completely, just dimmed a bit, enough to cast the room in a strange half-darkness. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, creeping across the floor toward the body on the slab. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It's just a power surge, I told myself, nothing to be afraid of. But the tapping returned, louder this time, like someone was knocking from the inside of a wooden box. My gaze drifted to the row of caskets stored along the back wall, awaiting use for upcoming services. I stared at them, the knocking coming in bursts now, echoing in the cold, still air. Slowly, I walked over and placed my ear against one of the caskets. The wood was cool to the touch. I could hear the faintest rustling coming from inside, like fabric brushing against something solid. I had to open it. I had to know. It felt like something was compelling me, like I was being drawn to that casket for a reason I couldn't explain. I reached for the latch, hesitating for a moment before flipping it open. Inside lay an old man, his face peaceful in death. There was nothing out of the ordinary about him. No signs of life, no twitching fingers or sudden breaths. Just a still, silent body. I let out a shaky laugh, embarrassed at how jumpy I'd become. But just as I was about to close the lid, I saw it, a faint movement under the man's eyelids. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Before I could react, the eyes shot open and the man's hand reached out, grabbing my wrist with a vice-like grip. His eyes were wild, full of panic, and his mouth opened, releasing a dry, hoarse whisper. "He's coming," he gasped, his voice raspy and strained. "Don't let him in." I pulled away, nearly falling back. The man's eyes closed again, and he was as still as before, his hand limp by his side. My heart pounded in my ears as I stumbled away from the casket. I didn't know what to think. Was this some kind of trick, a hallucination, or something else? I backed away toward the embalming table, and that's when I saw the middle-aged man was gone. The slab was empty. I felt the blood drain from my face as a chill ran through me. The door to the prep room swung open on its own, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway, moving away from me. Panicking, I grabbed my phone and rushed out into the corridor. The footsteps were faint, fading down the dimly lit hall. I followed, almost tripping over my own feet as I chased the sound. The hallway led to the storage room at the far end, a place we kept extra equipment and rarely used supplies. I could still hear the shuffling noise inside. I flung the door open, breathless and scared out of my mind. But there was no one there, just empty shelves and dust-covered equipment. I let out a shaky breath and turned to leave, when suddenly, all the lights went out, plunging the place into pitch darkness, and then I heard it again. Tap. 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 Right behind me, the lights flickered back on, and I turned around, finding myself alone in the storage room. I was done for the night. Whatever was happening, I didn't want any part of it. I left the mortuary, not even bothering to lock up, and didn't look back. The next day, I called in sick, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. There were times I'd hear tapping on my windows at night, or catch glimpses of movement in the dark corners of my apartment. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see that man's wild gaze and hear his whispered warning that I don't know who he is, or what's coming. But I'm starting to think that working in a place surrounded by death has its own kind of risks, ones I never believed in until now. The room. It's been a quiet job, being a mortician. Most people think it's creepy or unsettling, but it never really got to me. The dead don't talk back, don't judge you, don't make demands. It's peaceful. Or at least, it was until we got a special body in last month that I just finished up a routine embalming when I got a call from the local hospital about an unidentified John Doe who'd been found in an old, rundown house on the outskirts of town. The body had apparently been there for weeks before anyone discovered it. I was told that despite the time he'd been dead, the body was in an odd state of preservation. It hadn't decayed nearly as much as it should have. They thought maybe the cold air in that decrepit house slowed the process. Still, it didn't explain why his skin was almost intact and his eyes, though milky, still seemed to hold some sort of awareness. It wasn't my job to question the details, so I agreed to take care of the preparations. The body arrived late that evening, and I noticed right away what they meant. His skin was an eerie shade of grayish-white, almost like marble, with patches of frostbite that didn't quite look right. There was also a smell, but not the usual stench of death, more like damp earth mixed with something sweet, almost like rotting flowers. That I started with the usual procedures, disinfecting the body and setting up the embalming tools. As I leaned in closer to begin the process, I noticed something else. There were markings on his arms, deep scars that looked like they'd been carved into his skin a long time ago. They formed strange, looping patterns that I couldn't place. I've seen a lot of scars in this line of work, but these were unlike anything I'd encountered before. Almost like some sort of ritualistic carving that I chalked it up to one of those weird, unexplainable things you come across in this profession and got to work. As I was draining the blood and injecting the embalming fluid, the room suddenly seemed to grow colder. Now, the prep room was always a little chilly. It helped slow decomposition, but this was different. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, that makes your breath turn to mist. I glanced over at the thermostat, but it was set to the usual temperature that I tried to ignore it, focusing on finishing the job. I was just about to sew up the incisions when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the fingers on the corpse's right hand twitch. I froze, staring at the hand for several long seconds. It didn't move again, but I was sure I'd seen it that I reminded myself that muscle spasms can occur even in a dead body. It wasn't unheard of for the nerves to fire one last time. But then, it happened again. This time, the hand twitched more violently, and I saw the fingers curl inward as if he were trying to make a fist. That was not a natural movement for a body that had been dead for weeks. I felt my heartbeat quicken, and my hand started to tremble that I took a step back, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. I needed a break, that's all. As I turned to leave the room, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves scraping against the floor. I looked back at the table, and the body's eyes were open. Those pale, milky eyes were staring directly at me that I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a tray of instruments. My rational mind was trying to explain it. Maybe the lids hadn't been fully closed, maybe some air pressure change caused them to open. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The eyes weren't just open, they were locked onto me, almost as if they were following me. The rustling sound grew louder, filling the room, and then I saw it. The strange scars on his arms, they were changing. The lines and patterns seemed to be shifting, twisting as if they were alive, snaking around his skin in a slow, methodical motion. My stomach twisted into knots, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what was happening, but every instinct screamed at me to get out of there that I turned to rush out of the prep room, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like it had been welded shut. I pulled and tugged, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't move an inch. Panic was setting in, and my breath came out in shallow gasps. I spun around, and that's when I noticed it. The body wasn't on the table anymore. It was standing, right behind me. My entire body froze. He was standing there, as still as a statue, those milky eyes boring into me. His mouth was slightly open, and I could see that the inside of his throat was blackened and cracked, as though it had been burned. The markings on his arms were pulsating now, glowing with a dim, sickly light that I was trapped in that room with him, and I knew there was no way out. The corpse took a step toward me, and the sweet, rotting smell grew stronger. I stumbled backward, falling against the cold metal of the embalming table. The dead man's mouth twitched as if he was trying to speak, but the only sound that came out was a dry, rasping wheeze. Desperate, I grabbed a scalpel from the tray beside me and pointed it at him, my hand shaking uncontrollably. "Stay back," I shouted, though I knew how absurd it sounded, trying to threaten a dead man. But then, he spoke. It wasn't a voice that came from his mouth. It seemed to fill the entire room, vibrating through the walls, the floor, even inside my own head. "He comes for you," the voice echoed, distorted and inhuman. "He comes for us all." The lights flickered, and everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, the room was empty again. The corpse was back on the table, eyes closed, scars looking as lifeless as they should have been. The door was unlocked, swinging open slightly. I stumbled out of that room, my legs barely supporting me, and collapsed against the wall in the hallway. I didn't go back to work for a while after that. I told my boss I'd gotten sick, that I needed time off. He didn't ask questions. He never does. When I finally did return, the John Doe was long gone, buried somewhere or cremated, I'm not sure, and I didn't want to ask, but ever since that night, things haven't been the same. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that same rustling sound just outside my bedroom window. Sometimes, I wake up to find strange markings on my own arms, faint, but there. And once, just once, I heard that same voice in the dark, whispering, "He comes for you." I haven't figured out who, or what, it is, but I know one thing for sure, whatever followed that man into death hasn't finished with me yet. And I can't shake the feeling that, sooner or later, it'll come knocking on my door. The whisper. I've been a mortician for over 15 years now. It's not a job most people can handle, but for some reason, I've always found a sort of peace in it. There's a certain stillness that comes with the dead that feels, ironically, more predictable than the living. Or at least, it used to. My experiences didn't start out as a horror show. In fact, it was just a normal night at the mortuary when things took a dark turn. It was a Thursday, and I was working the late shift. We'd gotten a few new bodies in that day, but nothing out of the ordinary: accidents, natural deaths, a suicide. The kind of stuff I thought I was used to handling. The last one I was working on was a young woman, maybe in her late 20s. She had drowned, and the look of terror was still frozen on her pale face. Her eyes, half open, seemed to follow me around the room as I prepared her for embalming. I've dealt with all kinds of death expressions before, so I wasn't fazed by the unsettling gaze. At least, not at first. But there was something off about the air that night. It felt colder than usual, like the chill was seeping from the walls. Even the flickering overhead light seemed to be dimming more than usual, casting strange shadows over her body. The first strange thing I noticed was the radio. It was an old thing, but I liked keeping it on for some background noise. I was listening to some late-night talk show when, suddenly, it went silent. There was no static, no clicking sound like the signal was lost, just a complete, unnatural silence. I stopped what I was doing and walked over to give it a quick whack on the side, thinking it might have just died out on me. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the radio, though. It seemed to be coming from behind me. I turned around, half expecting to see a coworker messing with me, but I was alone in the room, just me and the body on the slab. I stood there for a few seconds, just listening. The whisper came again, but I couldn't make out the words. It was so soft, almost like it was traveling from the corners of the room, or from under the floor. "Who's there?" I called out, but as soon as the words left my mouth, the whispering stopped. The radio crackled back to life, and the host's voice filled the room again, just as if nothing had happened. I brushed it off and tried to get back to work, chalking it up to a lack of sleep or just my mind playing tricks on me. As I resumed preparing the body, I noticed something I hadn't before: her hands. I could have sworn they were in a slightly different position than when I started. I chalked it up to gravity, or maybe I'd accidentally nudged them while moving her. But as I went to adjust them, her fingers seemed colder than usual. Dead bodies are always cold, but this was different. It felt like frostbite, as if her skin was coated in a thin layer of ice. The uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach deepened, and I decided to speed things up. I just wanted to finish and get out of there. As I continued, that whispering came back. This time, it was more distinct. It sounded like a woman's voice, murmuring something I couldn't quite understand, but it was coming from the direction of the prep room door. When I looked up, the door was slowly swinging shut. I know I had left it open. I didn't like the idea of feeling trapped in there with the dead. I rushed over and flung the door back open, scanning the hallway for any sign of someone messing around. But the hallway was as empty and quiet as the dead themselves. Returning to the prep table, I could swear that the air felt thicker, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. And then I noticed it: her eyes. They were closed. I didn't close them. I was sure of that. I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow, and I moved to check the rest of her body, just to reassure myself. As I reached out to touch her again, her eyes shot open, wide as if in horror. And I could have sworn I saw her pupils dilate slightly, just enough for me to catch it. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the tray of tools. My heart pounded in my chest, and my instincts were telling me to leave that room immediately. But I was a professional, and I wasn't about to let a dead body get the better of me. I took a deep breath and stepped back up to the slab. "You're dead," I whispered, almost as if I needed to convince myself as much as her. "It's just in your head," I muttered, but the whispering came again, louder this time, as though it was closer, surrounding me. It was coming from her. Her mouth was closed, but the sound seemed to seep from her pale, frozen lips. I could hear the faintest of words now, repeating over and over. "Help me." It was like a bucket of ice water had been dumped over me. The room felt impossibly cold, and the dim light seemed to stretch the shadows in all the wrong directions. I could see my breath misting in the air. It didn't feel like I was in the prep room anymore. It felt like I'd stepped into some kind of void, and I don't know what came over me, but I reached out and touched her hand again. As soon as my fingers made contact with her icy skin, I felt a jolt, like an electric shock coursing up my arm. I pulled back and stumbled, and then I heard it, a blood-curdling scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't a natural sound, it was distorted, as if it was being played backward, like something trying to mimic a human scream. The lights went out and I was in complete darkness, with nothing but the sound of that scream still echoing in my ears. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in my pocket, and when I clicked it on, I saw her. She was sitting up, her mouth wide open in a silent scream. Her eyes were fixed on me, and there was a look in them that was all too alive. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pain, it was anger that I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to process what I was seeing. But before I could even think, the lights flickered back on. She was lying flat again, as if she'd never moved. Her eyes were closed, her hands resting at her sides, and the room was as silent as the grave. I could hardly breathe. I forced myself to finish the embalming as quickly as possible, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't know what had just happened, and I didn't want to stay long enough to find out. After that night, things at the mortuary were never the same. It wasn't just that one body. It kept happening, whispers, footsteps, doors creaking open, and that unnerving feeling of being watched. There were even nights when I'd swear I'd see figures standing just out of the corner of my eye. But whenever I turned to look, there'd be nothing there. That I still work there, believe it or not. I guess I'm too stubborn, or too scared to admit that something is wrong. But every now and then, when it's late and I'm alone, I swear I can still hear that voice, faintly whispering from the cold corners of the room, begging for help.